Good afternoon, and thank you for joining ADA for this webinar on Indigenous perspectives of disaster recovery. My name is Amanda Leck, and I'm the Executive Director of the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience, and I'm delighted to be your host today. I wish to start by acknowledging that I'm hosting this event from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all join us from today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this event. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of Australia. I will introduce our speakers shortly, but before I do, I would like to provide you with some brief housekeeping notes. Today's event will be recorded and made available after the event. Today we will be using the Q&A feature on Zoom to take questions, so please post your questions in the Q&A box and not in the chat window. You will be able to upvote questions by clicking the thumbs up button, and I will do my best to answer a number of those or ask a number of those questions to our speakers following the presentation today. I encourage you to use the chat window to share any thoughts or reflections during the presentations, and just a reminder that you will need to select all panellists and attendees in the drop-down menu for everyone attending today to be able to view your messages. I would also like to remind you to please be respectful to each other and our presenters when posting your comments or questions. So please join me in welcoming our speakers for today's webinar. Bhiamie Williamson from the Australian National University. Bhiamie is an Indigenous man from the Leo people in northwest New South Wales, Australia. In 2014, Bhiamie graduated from the Australian National University, and in 2017 from the Masters of Indigenous Governance at the University of Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. Bhiamie also holds graduate certificates in Indigenous Governance from the Native Nations Institute at the University of Arizona and Indigenous Trauma Care and Recovery Practice from the University of Wollongong. Bhiamie's research areas include Indigenous land management, cultural burning, Indigenous peoples and disaster recovery, and Indigenous men and masculinities. Our second speaker for today will be Sam Savage from the Australian Red Cross. Sam is a traditional owner of the Bindal Nation in Townsville. His ancestry is both Aboriginal, the Birragubba Nation, and Torres Strait Islander, Moa Island. He has worked with the Australian Red Cross since 2014 in a variety of roles, including leading recovery for the 2019 monsoon and flooding event within Townsville and the Northwest Queensland region, and is a member of the Australian Red Cross First Nations Recovery Group. Sam's current role is the North Queensland Emergency Services Regional Coordinator, where he assists various regions in the disaster preparedness, response and recovery space. Being a member of the Red Cross First Nations Recovery Group has enabled Sam to provide a cultural lens and influence a change in mindset, values and organisational practice both internally and externally across the emergency services sector. So over to you, Bhiamie.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for having me. Thanks for the introduction. So hi everyone. It's so nice to be delivering this seminar, and it's just so wonderful. Like I'm looking at the participants, and it's over 400 at the moment, which is just fantastic to have such an audience. And I've been watching everyone and reading everyone sort of coming in, introducing themselves and where they're from. And I just know we've got a really diverse audience, people from the research community, from the universities, which I'm also from, but also people from the practice, from the field of disaster recovery practice, from state-based organisations, and the large national NGOs and whatnot, and also just sort of some other people who are just introducing themselves. So welcome everyone. I really hope this is really excited to be delivering this seminar with Sam, and I'm joining today from Ngunnawal country, from here in very cold, snowing Canberra. It's actually really beautiful. So yeah, Bhiamie Williamson, I'm a Yuwalio man. So my mob come from northwest New South Wales, and we also go up into southern Queensland. And my mother comes from Cloncurry, and I actually grew up in Mount Isa. So for all the Queenslanders in the room, so I've seen a couple of them in there. Yeah, so I grew up there, and mum's from the Curry, and her family go up into the Gulf of Carpentaria, up into Queensland as well. So yeah, have a look. So if we just go to the next slide, so this will be the rough kind of outline of the presentation. So organising into different sections. So the first, I'll provide a bit of overall background of Indigenous peoples in disaster recovery, like what does it mean, and where is kind of this place and space at currently. And then I'll look at that as context, as providing context, and to contextualise some of the findings of our research of how Indigenous peoples were impacted during the Black Summer bushfires. Those two together, I think, will create a really powerful case that there needs to be a change in practice, and then finishing off with some shared learnings. So yeah, before I go into the next slide, I do just want to acknowledge as well some fellow travellers, some colleagues of mine who I've been working with, and this work that I'm presenting on isn't just my work, but it's also their work. So in particular, acknowledging Jessica Weir at Western Sydney University, and also my colleagues Phoebe Quinn and Lisa Gibbs at the University of Melbourne, for been working really hard over the last 18 months in this space. And I think this presentation, is a credit to their efforts and their work and their commitment to this as well. So next slide, jump into it. So Indigenous peoples in disaster recovery. So I guess this idea really emerged from this idea of disaster justice. Basically, disaster justice is just acknowledging that in times of disaster, whether that be bushfires or floods or cyclones or drought, existing inequalities are magnified and deepened within societies. So, but it's also kind of acknowledging that disasters are also transformative opportunities. So disasters often provide important moments in time when people really question existing practices, question the policy landscape, and really seek reform to respond to future challenges or emerging challenges, especially against the backdrop of an uncertain future and climate change and increasing climate change driven disasters. So what disaster justice broadly, the approach of disaster justice more broadly is that these key opportunities are also, great moments when we can start to look at and address historical injustices and create more just terms of engagement between all different parts of our society, really, and our diverse communities that we all live and enjoy. So next slide. When it comes to Indigenous peoples specifically, I guess, and this is kind of where our work starts to come into it. It's first acknowledging that Indigenous peoples have, I guess, historically been neglected, been left out, and they've been left behind in disaster recovery research, practice, and policy. And I guess that's kind of the starting point, that we know that Indigenous peoples are unique in Australian society, and it's kind of, there's no good excuse why Indigenous peoples have been so poorly represented and so poorly kind of brought into the tent of disaster recovery, when they stand to, as we will talk about, stand to sort of be impacted in greater ways. I guess it's created a really unfortunate situation where we're only really now starting to draw attention to the gaps, to draw out and discuss the key considerations, and also develop resources that can guide agencies and non-government organisations and really important institutions like local shire councils as well, and local organisations, where they can, providing the resources to give them the language, to give them the ideas and the knowledge and the content to be able to go and create, effective strategies for their local community as well. And I know Sam will talk about that in more depth as we move throughout the presentation. But the first step for us is really creating an awareness of how Indigenous peoples are uniquely impacted by disasters. For example, next slide, thanks. So these are just 4 ways really that we know that Indigenous peoples are uniquely impacted. So things like connection with country, You know, we all know Indigenous peoples are uniquely and intensely tied to their traditional homelands, to landscapes, to seascapes, to freshwater systems. You know, people are tied ancestrally, culturally, and these landscapes as well. They're not just sort of like the landscape as this overarching, like this, you know, landscape, but certain parts of the landscape as well. You know, mountain ranges, you know, water holes, sort of certain pieces, places along the coast, both on the land and underneath the water as well, and like ecosystem services as well, certain plants, certain animals, certain resources, certain trees. So Indigenous peoples are really closely linked to their landscapes. And so when you have disasters that impact landscapes, you know, it really deeply impacts Indigenous peoples as well. We also know that Indigenous peoples are politically and economically marginalised in Australia. And so, you know, how can they really engage in recovery processes when they are marginalised in the institutions that are kind of central to recovery processes? Indigenous peoples also have a really unique demographic profile. So we're a demographic profile grown from the bottom up. I think 50% of our population is underneath the age of 24. So 24 or under is more than 50% of our people. And that creates really important considerations when you think about long-term recovery strategies and long-term recovery efforts to support people, and in particular to support children and families. And the other thing I think, and this is, you know, definitely a legacy of colonisation, is that in Indigenous communities, generally speaking, Indigenous peoples, Indigenous communities have a deep mistrust for non-Indigenous agencies and institutions. And I think it's completely reasonable that those deep mistrusts remain when you consider the ongoing the ongoing impacts of settler colonialism, when you're thinking about the incarceration rates of Indigenous peoples, the removal of children from their families, and sort of just the general experiences of racism that Indigenous peoples, that is an unfortunate part of Indigenous people's lived experiences I guess on a daily basis. So these are just some indicators, and they show how Indigenous peoples are really uniquely placed within Australian society, and then what consequences this has for when disasters hit. So next slide, thanks. This is how it starts to come out. So that they're all the ideas. Now let's look at the Black Summer bushfires in particular, which has been kind of the bulk of our work in this space over the last 18 months. Let's look at how those ideas play out in practice. So this is the population profile of areas that were impacted, like what we call sort of the direct directly impacted areas of the bushfires, so areas that were burnt and in their immediate vicinity. And some colleagues and I mapped the population distribution of impacted communities in New South Wales, in Victoria, and the ACT, including Jervis Bay Territory, as you know, some of the hardest hit jurisdictions during the bushfires. And what we found was pretty extraordinary. So almost 90,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were directly affected by the bushfires. So in those 4 jurisdictions, New South Wales, Victoria, and the ACT, in the Jervis Bay Territory, to put into perspective, in those places, overall, the population of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is 2.6% of the general population. In the areas that were directly impacted, the percentage of Indigenous peoples jumped to 5.4%. And so you're talking about sort of a 250% increase, really, in the number of people sort of affected in that area, or 2.5 times more likely to be impacted from those fires in particular. So, you know, Indigenous peoples were, while still in the minority of the overall population that were impacted, you see a huge jump in how many people as a percentage of the population were impacted. But then when you start to drill down into the numbers a little bit more, it gets even more complicated. So yeah, next slide. So this next slide is the map of the age distribution of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the non-Indigenous population. So you can see the bold black lines are non-Indigenous, that's the non-Indigenous population in fire affected areas. And the grey lines, the hard grey lines that you can see, so that's the Indigenous population. It's such a contrast when you put them together and against each other. Like, so you see very few Indigenous people, elders as a proportion of the population. And, the largest cohort, the largest 5-year cohort of people that are affected are children aged 5 to 9 years. So we know that that the long-term impacts on children is like, there are long-term impacts on children from disasters, developmentally, educationally. And we also know that, some of the, especially in education, some of the, there's like a delayed onset of how they're, I guess, features, or what's the word I'm looking for? Like, there's a delayed onset of indicators, really. So it's not in the 1 or 2 years after something like a bushfire hits that you start to see a dip in people's in children's educational achievements. It's actually that 3, 4, 5, and even going on years later. And so knowing that Indigenous peoples are, disproportionately impacted, and that of that population, the most impacted are not just like young people, but children. It has real consequences for how we support these communities into the future, and real kind of consequences for education, in particular, education and mental health and well-being of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people. So I think, all of the stuff that we kind of thought was going to happen before the bushfires, or we kind of predicted these might eventuate, they did, and more so. So these are obviously some really interesting ways, but it's not just the population that Indigenous peoples are differently impacted. Next slide. So we also mapped the legal rights and interests of Indigenous peoples in the fire affected areas. So you can see kind of the shaded areas with the lines. So green down in Victoria and the blue up in New South Wales. These are current registered or determined native title or other kind of cultural heritage or formal recognition processes. You can see huge overlay with formally recognised rights of Aboriginal people and the areas that were directly impacted. And what's most surprising is that in most of those places, those native title groups actually weren't involved in the planning of disasters, like disaster planning ahead of time, recovery planning, and also in when the event hit as well. And so you see this real absence of people who have, really important rights that they hold communally, as a representative of their communities, of their country, being ignored. And even the areas where there are no kind of formal recognition rights, like there's still there, all of those landscapes are really heavily forested areas. They're so rich in cultural heritage values and resources that communities need. And so there's kind of, you can create a case of, regardless of whether there's formally recognised rights and interests in lands, like Indigenous peoples just need to be engaged in the planning for disasters and in the immediacy after a disaster hits as well. But we see very little of that during the fires. So it's not just the population, not just kind of children and education and mental health services. It's also really, really important legal consequences as well. Next slide. And so these are kind of things that we mapped out after the bushfires, but there was unfortunate stories, a lot of unfortunate stories, and I'm sure that people in here would have been aware of a number of them and heard a lot of the stories, but this is one that I think is really important, that I grabbed out from the submission of the National Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organisation to a Senate committee, where they spoke about some of the community controlled health organisations, particularly on the south coast of New South Wales, where this one is, Waminda, spoke about what they what they went through and how these community controlled organisations basically had to support their communities because government agencies and non-Indigenous organisations were not adequately supporting them at all. And we've seen, like in here, Waminda reported that some who tried to access recovery services or evacuation centres were treated really badly. So we've seen there's heaps of evidence about the consequences of culturally unsafe evacuation centres, of culturally incompetent staff going into communities, and Indigenous peoples basically encountering and experiencing racism at a time when they were incredibly vulnerable and in need of support, just as everyone else was. And so, these are kind of heartbreaking stories, really, from the front line and from communities who were affected. And so the work that I was involved with, really was trying to bring these stories out and to advocate specifically in the commissions and inquiries like the Royal Commission, the New South Wales Independent Inquiry, in Victoria, the establishment of Bushfire Recovery Victoria, including the establishment of an Aboriginal reference group, which was just kind of, quite out there compared to previous practices and previous responses. But to really bring this evidence and bring these stories to those policymakers. So next slide. And we start to see, some of that, the advocating did lead to some recognition. So this is from the final report of the New South Wales Bushfire Inquiry, where the authors of the inquiry really did acknowledge that Aboriginal communities were treated really poorly and treated badly. And in some cases, as I say here, services were reluctant to provide immediate relief. And these experiences really compounded the trauma that people were already experiencing. And so what you start to see is that the bushfires, actually in that event, the bushfires wasn't the biggest hazard for many Aboriginal people. The biggest hazard that they encountered was actually the services that were meant to be there to support them. And it just kind of, it's quite quite unreal to think about that it's kind of the bushfires was just the precondition for the real trauma that they would experience later on. And what this results is that, people choose not to access them, choose not to go there. And that results in people, putting themselves at greater risk as well. There are stories of Aboriginal people actually sleeping outside of evacuation centres because they feared how they would be treated inside, and that's just not good enough. Next slide, thanks. So we start to see some real movement in this space, and really understanding that for Indigenous peoples, these disasters, then they're intrinsically linked, and people, and this has real kind of real world. This needs to be, I guess, accounted for and understood, in particularly by recovery agencies who are entrusted to lead relief and recovery efforts. To understand that for Indigenous peoples, it's not just, say, the bushfires, it's not just this one instance, not just this one event that people need support for, it's the whole range of events. And indeed, when Indigenous peoples come and want to access these services and talk about how they're feeling and talk about their trauma and what they've been through, rarely will they just talk about the singular event. They'll talk often about historical events. They'll talk about things that people generally wouldn't think are, people need support with in that moment. For instance, people that we work with said that the evacuation was a hazard that they encountered. The evacuation was caused because of the bushfires. The bushfires occurred because they were marginalised from managing their country. Marginalisation happened because they were removed from country. They were removed from country because of disease and conflict, and disease and conflict was caused because of the invasion of their homelands. And so what you see is not one disaster, but multiple interconnected, cascading disasters that Indigenous peoples place themselves in and really understand. And so when we talk about a culturally competent workforce and culturally competent agency staff, you need to be prepared for is that people are going to come and want to talk about any one or multiple of the links in this chain. And people really need to understand history and have a shared sense of that history to be able to support people effectively. And I think that's kind of, you know, what's been guiding a lot of our work as well. Next slide, thanks. Yeah, so, but it's not just kind of, we're also pushing back and making sure that we're not going down sort of the vulnerability rabbit hole too much, because Indigenous communities are incredibly resilient, and those resilience traits, I guess, have been fashioned both that have existed sort of pre-colonization, have always been traits in the community, things like really close social bonds, really interconnected kinship networks and kin caring, but also have been fashioned in response to colonization. For instance, you know, shared histories. Indigenous peoples have a shared history and a shared understanding of what they've all been through. And that's broadly applicable for Aboriginal people, no matter Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, no matter where they're from, no matter when colonization first hit, no matter how developed their homelands, people have a shared understanding of history, a shared experience of marginalization, of invasion, of wars and conflicts, and of these disasters as well. And so, you know, the people who are best placed to support Indigenous people are actually Indigenous peoples themselves, because they have that shared understanding of history. Yeah, sort of also using and capitalising on Indigenous healing. There's a whole body of work around Indigenous healing now, both in Australia and internationally. And even though Indigenous healing in its modern form really emerged from the removal of Indigenous children from their families and homelands, there are really important lessons in Indigenous healing that can help support Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in their moments of need. Yeah, and I think it's sort of like understanding those practices and embedding them in a workforce would be really go a long way to creating a really culturally safe work environment and culturally safe environment for Indigenous peoples to access in times of disaster. Yeah, next slide, thanks. So it's really need to understand these, what we call kind of, or conceptualize as building blocks. So things like at the bottom, the close social bonds, strengths-based discourses, shared understandings of history, Indigenous healing. So that's kind of, those things are already there. They're community traits, they're highly resilient, they promote resilience in communities. And so what you need to do is like build on that. And so by building on that with things like culturally safe physical spaces, adequate resourcing, culturally competent staff, and being embedded in disaster planning, what you start to see is quite a strong structure, or quite a strong foundation to develop holistic strategies of supporting Indigenous peoples in these times of disasters. But the most important thing is understanding the resilience traits that communities have, and then how one can build upon that. Yeah, next slide. And I think there's also shared learnings for non-Indigenous people. For instance, like questions such as, you know, what can non-Indigenous peoples learn from engaging with Indigenous notions of healing? There's an incredibly deep and rich, well-developed literary base around that now, and practice base as well. And I think that there's some really practical, I guess, strategies to promote healing in communities. And I really think that non-Indigenous people would learn quite a lot from how to work with people, you know, how to embed trauma-informed practices in their, you know, in their work, and also some strategies to bring communities together, and things like yarning circles and exploring people's thoughts and feelings through artwork and through shared activities and things like that, and connecting with the environment or country. Yeah, things like strengths-based, like what are the strengths that exist in non-Indigenous communities that can be built upon in times of disaster to create more resilient communities? Yeah, and how might we use Indigenous resilience traits to make non-Indigenous communities more resilient? So it's not just a one-way street. I actually think there's a really healthy environment of co-learning and of mutual respect to be developed in this space, and it's certainly, yeah, what we're trying to develop through our research practice as well. Yeah, so it's not, I think it'll, by engaging with Indigenous perspectives in disaster recovery, I think it'll enrich the whole field more generally. Yeah, and just encourage people to really be open to learning. So it's not kind of like, it is, you know, it could be considered work. It's also just sort of like an intellectual journey, really, that people go on. And if people are open to new ideas and people are willing to question their practices, perhaps question things that they weren't questioning before. I think there's really fertile soil to create, more resilient communities as a whole. So we'll just go to the next slide, and I think that that about wraps me up, and would welcome any feedback, both obviously in response to questions, but also after as well. And I think I'm going to hand over to Sam to talk a little bit more. So thanks everyone. Look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Brother Bhiamie. Look, hello everybody. Watamuli. Watamuli from my Birragubba Nation language means hello and welcome. As Amanda mentioned, I have both Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultural heritage, which I'm very proud of. And having connections to both land and sea is just a blessing for living up in the North Queensland area in Townsville. So firstly, acknowledging the Waggarookaba and Bindal peoples of the land that I'm presenting on today, up in Townsville, North Queensland. It's 26 degrees up here, so no shirt, no jumpers or anything. It's lovely tropical weather as we have it up in the tropics. Just a bit about myself as well. Just being in mentioning my cultural heritage, I think I was really blessed with being able to learn from my parents, family elders and community elders, a lot about our cultural beliefs, our connections to family and country, knowing my totems, knowing traditional healing practices and hunting and gathering and all the different stuff about caring for country has been really, really opportunistic for me to be able to empathize and really know how other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities across the country are feeling when it comes to disaster recovery, but also responding from an event as well, or in an event. So what I'm going to talk to everyone today is more around practice and my experience through a bit of recognition for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, getting a voice at the table, and being included around the planning for recovery, and then how we're going forward in regards to learning and learnings from that recovery example that I'm going to share with you today. So a bit about myself as well in the professional side. I've had about 30 years experience in various industries such as education, employment, child safety, youth justice, social justice systems. Throughout that time, there has been a big focus around, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander inclusion and getting a voice to change practice for the better for both our people, Aboriginal and Islander people, Torres Strait Islander people, but also for the systems itself that we work in, and have that flexibility around understanding and embedding and changing mindsets for our mainstream society workers, professions. But as I said, it's all about the systems that we work in. So currently with Red Cross, I've been with Red Cross for about 7 years now, and in a variety of different roles. But my current role is the North Queensland Emergency Services Regional Coordinator, which basically is where I engage with a lot of the local disaster management groups across the northern region. And that's basically to build partnerships, connect with, and be a liaison advisory member between Red Cross and to local shires around what we can provide, and then take it back to what the needs are of community. Prior to that, my current role, I was in the 2019 recovery, monsoonal recovery program, which basically focused around the big monsoonal event that we had. It was around Australia Day 2019, and we had about a week and a half of continuous heavy rain. And what happened was we basically, or not we, but the government had a decision to having to open up the floodgates and release a whole lot of excess water that was just building up in the dam, and obviously impacted on a whole range of different suburbs throughout Townsville, and impacted through houses being inundated with waters up to the roofs and over the roofs in specific areas. But you know, it was really, really devastating. A 1 in 100 year event, they called it. But thousands of households damaged, lost. Fortunately, there was no lives directly impacted, and we, you know, it was all good. But it was mostly infrastructure, housing, and a lot of businesses, unfortunately, were impacted as well. So throughout the flood event, I think in the response phase, it was more around, you know, lives, safety of lives were paramount. But then came the recovery phase. So, you know, immediate recovery, it's still about, you know, getting infrastructure sorted, making sure businesses are back up and running, and people are supported as best as they can be with the primary, basic primary care needs that could be provided at that time. What my role was in this space was to basically engage in the different, you know, recovery subgroups. From the local disaster management group, they had a local human and social recovery subgroup. So that was a focus around people. They would have, you know, different pillars within government, so environmental, infrastructure, economic, a whole range of different ones. But we, Red Cross, were focused in the people sort of space where, you know, our main support sort of role is around psychosocial support. And I think for us, it was around trying to identify where we could fit into the picture of supporting our Townsville community, but also the Northwest communities that were also impacted out west, where the waters unfortunately ran out there. And plus there was heavy rains as well that impacted on a whole loss of stock, property damage, and also, you know, a lot of emotional trauma that went through the people out west as well. So with our program in Red Cross, what we did was we had a few different focus areas of, you know, community capacity, more so than one-on-one support to different individuals or families. And our core objectives was around community capacity. So, you know, providing expert advice to community leaders, support services, informal community leaders, all that sort of stuff, providing training and education to frontline workers, you know, facilitating psychosocial support at different recovery centres or evac centres, and then embedding, you know, community resilience back into the school communities. So with the program, that was some of the core businesses, but engaging at a local level through government, planning around that human and social recovery group, and having good relationships as well was a benefit. But what we did was we started to identify some of the vulnerable groups that were impacted a bit more than just the normal community. So in response, obviously it's a one whole community that we're looking at. But when we step back a bit and then look at community needs and focusing on people, there's a whole range of different community groups within a community. So by identifying some of these vulnerable groups that, as they state, you know, we had groups such as elders, youth, disabilities, mental health, and cultural and linguistic diverse, and of course, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and communities as well. So I had the opportunity of facilitating the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander task force recovery group. And in saying that, that's where, you know, we'd basically form a key stakeholder group of different support services, community leaders, have a bit of a conversation around, you know, what were the impacts of our mob, of our peoples in Townsville, what might we forecast as being some of the impacts and needs that we need to identify to support families and communities. And within that sort of space, we were then able to take it back to the table of the local government, and talk about these sort of needs that are going to impact, that we're impacting on our people, and how could we develop a strategy to support the variety of whatever needs that were discussed at the time. I think the important part about this was the recognition that there was a need for a voice to be, provided back to the local government, state government, all the local community services providers, because as I said, it's not about one community, it's a whole range of different communities in the one. And having that voice in this space was really, really beneficial to then make everyone accountable, I suppose, for those different groups, in particular, what we're talking about today, our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander task community members. So what we did out of the group, when we did take it back to the table, we discussed about, from what Bhiamie mentioned before, the challenges of people actually even coming forward. Our people, our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community members, coming forward to seek support, whether it be financial, for housing needs or whatever needs they may have required at the time. But going into those recovery centres was even daunting in itself, given that a lot of the faces were non-Indigenous faces, or not non-Indigenous faces, but the feeling were non-Indigenous sort of approach to supporting our mobs. A lot of people were ignored at the doors. Not everyone, but there were a lot that were coming back to say, look, we were a bit intimidated by going in, and just having that feel of having some cultural safe environment space as well inside those recovery centres was very much needed when we did a bit of a review, but also having Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander volunteers or staff within the different services to create a bit more safety towards our people as well. So what we're doing at the moment, we did a bit of a review around that, and talking with state government, looking at the different services that do have identified specific support structures in place to support community. We're tapping into those sort of groups at the moment to now form for our next event. Hopefully we can have a supply base to move in and support community when needed. Some of the learnings from that as well was about not being reactive, but being a bit more proactive to start around the actual preparedness stuff, being able to know what we need to cater for in regards to responding to an emergency as well, not just doing the healing and the recovering stuff once an event has gone through. So for us moving forward in this recovery space, it is around building community resilience, not just supporting them through a healing process. So in future events, when we do have them, our vision, our future sort of approach will be to start building around preparedness, building that community resilience around knowing, what's around the corner in regards to events, how are we going to respond, and what are the local needs of those communities. And when we say local needs, only community can tell us that stuff. It's not about what data we have, what support services are there. We need to hear from the community itself, but also, as Bhiamie said, it has to be community-led. And when we say community-led and driven, have a lot of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander workers or personnel and resources specific to direct and lead, and then build on that recovery phase as well. The other learnings that we did look at was most recovery programs and specific recovery workshops are not aware of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community cultural understandings, and may not be effective unless determined efforts are made. So an example of that is probably recognizing and acknowledging the connection to country, the specific grief and specific grief associated and different impacts of disruptions of country and land, and the history, spiritual and traditional well-being. So when we talk about that, we just had NAIDOC only a few weeks back, and we talked about healing country or heal country. And a lot of our people do have connections to country. It's not just about homes and the physical stuff that we see that are lost through events, through disasters, but it's also that loss of, spiritual space or the connection to a part of country that you may have to be not removed, but move somewhere else for a short time, where your heart and your spirit's back at that other space. So having an understanding and a bit of an empathy towards those impacts on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples can go a great deal of ways in supporting our mobs and healing. And it has to be recognised first. It's not just, like I said, about the physical and the home space. Even when we do go into the community needs assessments, I think we need to really be aware and take on, cultural and community protocols, the importance of an invitation, either by invite into a community, or if we're in a rural or regional setting, providing an invitation to, traditional owners or community leaders or different key Indigenous support services that can add value to the recovery process. That's the sort of stuff we need to include when we're doing our community needs assessment. But also, as I mentioned before, it has to be community-led and community-driven as well. I think a lot of the times we're trying to do a lot of the work where community are going, hey, that mightn't be the stuff that we need, even though you think it is. Step back, listen to us, and we'll tell you and show you how it can be done with your support. So when I say with your support, it's not about community do it in isolation. It's about it, recovery being done in partnerships, and long-term investment plus sustainability to heal properly is another major part that we need to be considerate of when we're talking about recovery or healing in communities, in our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. So I think for us, we might have a lot of the times in recovery, we might go for 2 years, which they say long term, but recovery could take forever. But if we can have some sort of sustainable approach to recovery, not just a short-term band-aid approach of a 1 to 2 year funding project or program, that's the stuff that we really need to consider if we want to assist in support community and healing properly. So that was a bit of the experience around the practice in Townsville at the local level. But I wanted to also just mention a bit about how we're moving forward in Red Cross with the development of our Red Cross First Nations recovery group as well. So through the bushfires, we had a few positions that were identified positions, as we call it, having a few Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community people come in, and also their roles were to provide a bit of a cultural lens, and really focus on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and peoples within those bushfire impacted areas. So what we did with this recovery group, we had recovery workers from all over the country in different states. We've now formed a national recovery team that, as I just mentioned, it's about providing Red Cross with a cultural lens on the practice, emergency services practice values, but we're looking to not just have it internally. We need to get it outwards, meaning, to our external disaster management sectors as well, such as state government bodies that are right in the core of response and community resilience. And I think for us, if we're able to, be included in that sort of stuff, and not included, but being able to influence, advocate on the needs of community, recovery can go a long way to support First Nations peoples, communities, and Australia in general, because climate change is at the forefront now, and with all the impacts of that, we are going to see a lot of our rural, remote communities heavily impacted, and we need to start developing strategies to really plan forward and looking at how we walk alongside our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander brothers and sisters. So for me, I think the importance to recognise and include Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, communities, key support services into planning for, responding to, and healing from disasters or collective trauma events are pivotal in regards to being successful at recovery across Australia. So for me, a bit of the considerations for you as a recovery support specialist, learner, worker, is, as I mentioned, take a step back, have an open mindset to change your own behaviour and practice around working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and communities, but then refocus your energy on walking alongside our peoples, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of Australia. So what I might do, I might just finish it at that, and then we may open up for questions or hand back to Amanda.
Thanks so much, Sam. And I think we're bringing Bhiamie back now. Thank you, Bhiamie, as well. That was really insightful and such rich presentation, so much knowledge you've generously shared with nearly 500 people today. And thank you. I saw, Bhiamie, you've already answered one of the questions live online. So thank you for jumping in and doing that. There are a number of questions to get through. Please keep your questions coming. We'll get through as many of those questions as we can in the next half an hour or so. I suppose I have one to start off with, and it's around, Bhiamie, what you spoke about, disaster justice. We're more and more seeing, for all Australians, the impacts of disasters from a sort of social justice perspective. So those that are the most disadvantaged, have the worst impacts due to disasters, but particularly within the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community, that's just exacerbating, disadvantage and on a whole range of areas. I just wanted to ask you a bit more around that concept, if you like, of disaster justice, and whether it is something that is, coming to the fore now in terms of, research papers and advocacy work that you're doing.
Yeah, so firstly, I will say that I don't profess to be an expert in disaster justice as in the general field. So my research has obviously been very targeted on understanding the impacts and how impacts disasters impact Indigenous peoples differently and separately than non-Indigenous people. But I think sort of the idea of disaster justice is how can I say this? To not engage with it perpetuates the problems. And so it's really whether to participate or not, they're inherently political decisions, quite frankly. By doing it's not like we're not going to engage with it because we're too risk averse. It's like, well, it's bad for business to not address it. And so in that way, I think it really does need to form a pivotal kind of, foundation stone in all kind of recovery processes, in recovery planning. Because it's the consequences of not obviously being prepared are quite profound and can last a very long time. So, so I'd suggest, yes, it is an absolute integral component of it. There are some wonderful resources out, some wonderful kind of peer-reviewed publications and some books on disaster justice as well. And it would just be really great if we kind of seen the disaster justice literature be used a little bit more in the resilience literature. Because to have resilient communities, you need to address historical injustices. So, and it's why wouldn't we want to have a more inclusive society, that supports everyone in ways that they want and need to be supported in their moments of need.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. Look, I'm going to go to some questions from our participants. As I said, there are many of them. So people looking for advice around mental health, and very interested to learn about Indigenous healing approaches to complex and multi-layered trauma that impact communities affected by disasters. So on top of that long-term trauma from colonialisation that you spoke of, Bhiamie, and then that acute trauma of the natural disaster itself. So people keen to understand what some approaches could be to Indigenous healing to work with the communities they're working with.
Yeah, I think sort of the healing literature is like it is really varied, and I do urge caution that Indigenous healing literature is, like I said, it's been developed to respond to very specific occurrences in Indigenous communities, of very specific events, you know, and things like it. You know, the biggest body of literature in Indigenous healing is responds to the unique needs of children, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are taken away from their families, you know, children in the silent generations, and the need to promote healing for them. And so just sort of a word of caution that we can't sort of grab everything in the healing literature and just apply it in a natural hazards kind of disaster planning, disaster recovery context. It just, you know, we can't sort of make a square peg fit into a round hole, but there are important lessons. And the first one is that Indigenous peoples do have these healing traditions. We do have our, you know, our ways to treat illness, and we do have ways to support communities through shared trauma that they experience. And a lot of those are really culturally rooted as well, which, you know, you again need to sort of urge caution that we can't just sort of supplant Indigenous healing from here and apply it to non-Indigenous communities. And there is a process of like understanding the principles and how it works and how it operates in practice, so that you can sort of like mend it, mold it, adjust it to apply to a community. But there are some really clear lessons also that I think, so things like strengths-based approaches. So you don't go in sort of saying to a community that they're incredibly disadvantaged, even though they might be. You don't go in and tell them that they've been through a massive disaster, even though they may have been. You go in and you sort of ask them, like, who is the community? What are the positive traits of the community? What do you get? Now, what sports do you play? What are the community activities? What are the cultural festivals in the community? And then it's kind of like, by getting that view and how the community operates and the strengths of that community, you know, you use them, you build on them to create really effective and locally place-based kind of engagement, recovery strategy, sorry. So strengths-based is one. Two is like connections with the environment. So obviously Indigenous people's connection with country. For Indigenous peoples, the recovery of the natural environment and the recovery of communities, they go hand in hand. They're not separate things, they're exactly the same thing. And I think especially for a lot of regional and rural communities, places that have a lot of, where people are quite outdoorsy, where people enjoy the natural kind of features, the natural assets of places. It's sort of one of the great reasons of living in the country or living along the coast. But those landscapes need to be recovered post-disaster as well. And getting community involved in recovering those environmental assets is a real therapeutic intervention. Yeah, other things like just sort of the need for socially and culturally safe spaces as well. Indigenous healing, we know that you can't just get a group of people who have been through an event and who carry historical or complex trauma and put them in any old room and say, go for it, heal. You know, you need to, the physical space that people gather, where they choose to gather, what that looks like. Is there food and beverage? Are those things kind of adequate and supported? That really matters. We know that culturally and socially safe physical spaces really matter. And so when you start to put these different kind of healing strategies into place, strength-based approaches, recovery of natural assets, socially and culturally safe physical spaces, I would hazard a guess that they're all things that non-Indigenous communities could learn from, could pick up and practice in their own place. So it's kind of Indigenous communities, non-Indigenous communities actually learning from Indigenous peoples. Like, how radical a thought is that really, and changing their practice to do this. So Indigenous people are really kind of quite experts in their own healing practices. And I think there's some really wonderful strategies that are more broadly applicable to everyone. But I'll end by saying that it's really important also that, you know, as Indigenous peoples, especially in research and practice, they often choose not to engage for fear of being separated and from their knowledges. So if if people, if people listening are really wanting to learn from Indigenous healing practices, that needs to go hand in hand with actually supporting the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities from which that knowledge comes. We can't separate people from their knowledges. So it's about working with them, employing them, acknowledging their work, acknowledging their labour, being fair and addressing sort of barriers for them participating in civil society as well in those local places. So we can't just sort of grab Indigenous practices and use it in non-Indigenous contexts without addressing historical marginalisation of Indigenous peoples in those places as well. They need to go hand in hand.
Thanks,
Amanda, just wanted to add, I think just the importance of, changing some of our communication, our language of, people aren't really, when we talk about vulnerability, we're changing that sort of talk to more resilience. So as Bhiamie said, our people have been resilient for over 60,000 years, managing country, living on country, working on country, but adapting to change over time as it changes as well. So for us with natural disasters, it's going in to support a community and knowing what the different needs are. As I said, when you're going into a space, it's recognizing and being focused around, hey, these mob do know how to manage themselves. It's just about what can we provide to assist them to get back up and heal their own journey in regards to recovery. So that's some of the stuff that I really wanted to highlight, is around just changing our communication sort of approach around, a lot of the vulnerable groups that we do discuss, they're actually not vulnerable, they're just marginalized more so than, within the system itself. So for me, I think resilience is a big player for our people.
Agree with you more as a community development practitioner myself, that need to take a strength-based approach and work with communities and, understand what assets they bring and all that. It's so important. So thank you both for articulating that for the participants. We often find that people on these calls are looking for quite specific advice. So I might go to you, Sam, first, but people are trying to understand, how do they provide culturally safe spaces within evacuation centres in particular? You both spoke to that for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. If people don't have a workforce that, can support that, what are some of the steps that they can take to ensure that those spaces are culturally appropriate? And I might add at the moment that AIDA will be redeveloping the evacuation planning handbook and companion documents, and I would like to extend an invitation for either of you to be part of that work, or to ensure we have appropriate Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander representation on that work group, because what you spoke about was so important. So to you, Sam, first, for some practical guidance on what people can do to ensure those spaces are culturally appropriate and safe.
Yeah, I think from a practice point of view, it comes back to your organisation that you work for, to have some type of plan around embedding, cultural competent practice in working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, whether it be doing supporting evacuation centres, or recovery centres, or doing outreach into communities, some type of cultural competency training awareness, recovery specific or response specific, to become more aware. But there's no real magic one to go, hey, this is how you do it. It's all about community engagement, having that open mindset, having a humanitarian approach, and being non-judgmental around people's needs. Everyone's human, and just around here listening to people, and walking that journey as much as you can to assist and support people. But I think for us, it's around, like I said, not being biased towards what the color of your skin is, or what culture you come from. Everyone that's in need of support through an event should be, have that opportunity to walk into an evac center no matter what, and receive the same sort of support, no matter who you are or where you come from. So for me, one is coming back to your organization that you work for, that you may be, going into to be working in an evac centre, making sure that that organisation has that sort of awareness plan, or looking at the disaster resilience evac centre management plans and guidelines, and maybe we need to embed that sort of content into that stuff, into that resource, to then have it as a bit of a framework and a consideration tool for our up and coming recovery workers.
Well, that's certainly my commitment to you both, that Ada will do that when we redevelop this evacuation planning guideline and toolkit. And as I said, we would like to work with you both. Bhiamie, did you want to make a comment about evacuation centres?
Yeah, sure. So it's a great question, and I think we've seen, the flip side of the negative experiences of and traumatic experiences of Aboriginal people trying to access evacuation centres, particularly on the south coast of New South Wales and Far East Gippsland in Victoria during the fires, and those areas because they were really impacted by the fires, but also they've got really high populations of Aboriginal communities, and there's quite a number of discrete Aboriginal communities in that place as well. And in those places, the first thing I would say is, in the planning for those disasters, like, do the organisations even know how many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people there are there? Do they even know where the discrete communities are? Do they know how many young people, how many old people? Do they know the health of their communities, their health needs, and people with disabilities, and the chronic health issues that plague communities? Do they know that? If they don't have that data, they're not in a strong position to offer effective evacuation and support. And that's very tangible stuff that can be done not during a disaster. It needs to have been done before. And if communities, if these regions, if the local councils, if the recovery areas, or the NGOs that are separated in the areas that manage different areas, if they don't know that stuff, are they working with Aboriginal community controlled organisations that do know that stuff? One of the great kind of institutions now in our communities are our community controlled health organisations. I think they are so wonderfully integrated into community. They are community run. And it also means that they have the knowledge of those communities as well. They know where the elderly are. They know where the big families live in sort of the small housing. They know what likely routes people are going to take out, and where people are connected to different communities outside who can be supported to get to and from different places. In the evacuation centres, like, for example, what we know from the response, from the experiences of Indigenous peoples in the South Coast and Far East Gippsland, they walked into these massive evacuation centres. The first thing that they were looking for, and it's the first thing all Indigenous people will look for when they go into those spaces, is another black face. Where is my local community controlled health organisation? Where is my local land council? Where is my community co-op? They should be here. And you had experiences of Indigenous people walking into those centres, looking around, and all they seen were non-Indigenous people. They didn't see anyone from their own community there. And it all automatically, it says to them, it communicates to them that you're not a part of this. This isn't your community. You're separate from all of this, and it creates automatically, without a word being spoken, a sense of culturally unsafe and not understanding. And then also, so like that needs to be that, like, it's basic stuff that needs to occur. Work with community organisations, know the community, and plan for, and most importantly, have someone there when community walk into those places that they know, that they're familiar with, and that they can sort of just sit down and have a cup of tea with, and ask them if they're okay, and ask them if their families are okay. And then that would be the first building blocks, and then there's so much that needs to come on from that. And I draw particular attention to the need to respect the the sanctity of elders in particular. It's not appropriate for a lot of communities. It's not appropriate for elders to be, with general populations and mixing with big crowds of people. For families, for mums and bubs and things like that. So you kind of get into some some really local strategies and the needs of local communities. And but in the first instance, know your community, engage with the local governing institutions, and you know, have someone there who the community knows.
Thank you. And I note that you said earlier about, you know, employing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples into these, you know, roles where they are working directly with their own communities. So someone has asked, you know, how do we engage with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples when we know that, you know, they're fatigued by people trying to engage with them? Well, you know, you answered that question really. Employ people and build this into your preparedness work rather than sort of bolting it on at the end when you're in the recovery phase. A lot of what you spoke about then, Bhiamie, can be done now. We don't have to wait for the next disaster.
Absolutely. And in fact, waiting for the next disaster will make it another proper disaster again for Indigenous peoples, and it kind of says that nothing really has been learnt. And then, yeah, sort of engaging with communities, it doesn't, you know, things that Sam spoke about, NAIDOC 2 weeks ago, are the recovery organisations getting out into communities during their NAIDOC festivals? You know, are they participating in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community events that happen in all of our communities all the time? You know, it's like that outreach work needs to be active, it needs to be planned, it needs to be organised. That's how you build relationships. So it's not a matter of sitting in your office trying to call an organisation and say, hey, we need to have a relationship. No, get out there, meet people, talk to people, involve yourself in the community, and you'll understand very quickly the power and, you know, the strength of the community as well.
It's Sam here, Amanda.
Sam?
Just wanted to add to that responses. I mentioned about long-term investment, and I think for me to have a sustainable approach to building community resilience for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and communities, you know, government, recovery industry, we need to be true to ourselves around, hey, how much are we going to invest in our people, in our First Nations people, to support that sort of, you know, preparedness, response, and the healing stages? Because at the moment, we're reacting to an event more so than getting ready for the next one. So every time an event will come through, we'll respond. Then we go back to, okay, what did we learn from here, and how can we make it better? We really need to go, hey, let's start now and build better now, build stronger, and really invest in that commitment to build community resilience straight up.
So changing tack to a question from Dr. Mel Taylor, who's done an enormous amount of research in relation to animals in disasters. Can either of you please provide any comments about Aboriginal people's relationship with animals, both domesticated and wildlife, in relation to disasters, particularly in that sort of response and recovery? And is there anything that we can do better?
Sure, I can sort of respond to that, and then maybe Sam can respond as well. So it's, I think, sort of, yes, Indigenous peoples are really connected to landscapes, including wildlife. Some Indigenous people do have very intimate connections with certain plants and animals and the like, certain birds, and it's really important for environmental agencies and organisations who is in a post disaster landscape, post floods, post bushfire, post cyclone, to really go in and monitor those populations really closely and carefully, because it has enormous consequences for people's ongoing connection with their country and their ability to practice culture. For instance, Indigenous people who might have a totemic plant, or a certain family or something that might have a totemic, a totemic bird or something in a landscape. What happens? What are the consequences for that particular group of people if that bird doesn't come back after a bushfire? You know, it really fundamentally shakes and calls into question the foundations of their cultural identity and who they are. And this is kind of where we get to, you know, it's one thing for non-Indigenous people to be really aggrieved and to be really affected by particularly sort of like a post bushfire landscape. You know, it's even now when you go through the areas that were impacted, it's still really quite depressing and confronting. But for Indigenous peoples to go in there and see, and to be, and they would be going in and looking for their plant. They'll be looking for their bird, their animal, their fish. And so, you know, knowing, and even sort of going in and asking what are the really important species or the really important resources in this that existed in the landscape. And as we rejuvenate the landscape and regenerate it post disaster, are there ways that we can regenerate it in such a way as to promote the return and even a more healthy ecosystem post disaster with those cultural values, cultural environmental values in it. So yeah, we don't want to get into sort of specifics, but I know for many communities that is the way it is, and I think that Indigenous peoples are really active in that process as well, going in and planting, not just planting trees, but planting certain trees. And it may not have to do with that tree specifically, but they might know that tree, the seeds of that tree will attract a bird, and it's the bird they want to come back. So understanding how it's all connected and that people are actually doing it already is really important. And it's just a question of, are they supported to do it?
Sam, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, Amanda, I think it's connection to country, connection to land and sea. For me, through my journey, and as I mentioned right at the start, knowing that people have a certain connection, whether it be through totemic food source, healing, traditional healing medicines, all that sort of stuff, we need to know the impacts, but also come back to the prevention side and minimizing the risk of harm to those sort of, whether it be animals or flora or fauna, connecting up with the Indigenous bushranger organisations throughout the country, working with those different groups, Indigenous groups, to then, build that community resilience again. So it mightn't just be around the people sort of side. We can work towards land and sea conservation management to look at the environmental impacts and how we can, minimize that risk of harm there as well around the cultural sort of flora and fauna throughout the country. So for me, would be, really tapping into that sort of industry around natural resource management, cultural resource management, connecting with those different range of groups that are out and about across the country, because there are heaps, and then connecting with them and learning a lot of the cultural practices that they've been doing for over, thousands of years, because I think it's really worthwhile in connecting culture with science to get, the best values out of everybody.
Thank you. Look, we only have time for a couple more questions, but I've seen this one from Isaiah from New Zealand, which I would like to ask you, and I won't try and pronounce his greetings, but he says, "Greetings to you both, descendants of the people who dream." So he asks, aspirationally, what does lifting the capability across the public sector look like for you? And is there a balance between lifting capability and what is taboo or sacred, particularly in terms of your knowledge systems? And how would you balance that?
Yeah, great question. And kia ora from our land to yours. It's a really good question. And I think that sort of, the first thing is how many Aboriginal staff are in your organisation. It's like if there's none or really low numbers, well then I suggest that needs to be the first capability or capacity building strategy. And then, but it's not just staff coming in as well. It's like, where are those staff in the organisation? If you've got, a wonderful workforce of 5% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but you've got no managers, which is often the case, especially in public service directorates. That's another big issue. So the key thing is, like, are Indigenous people embedded throughout the structure of an organisation? Are they the workers? Are they the managers? Are they the decision makers? Are they in the executive? And it needs to be kind of layered and throughout different agencies and organisations. And that's how you will build Indigenous perspectives, I guess, throughout. And the other thing is, like, do the relevant and do like relevant adequate strategies or policies exist that people can, like, an organisation can articulate, how their work impacts Indigenous peoples and how they'll engage with Indigenous peoples to achieve the objectives of the organisation or the agency. And so it's kind of like, embedding Indigenous peoples within the fabric of the organisation and making sure there are fit for purpose strategies or policies to engage with communities.
Sam, would you like to comment on that? I mean, Red Cross has done some work with regard to capacity building through this First Nations group that you're part of. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, look, I think it's around that investment again, the investment approach of how serious is an organisation or a government body about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs, whether it be disaster management, education, employment, whatever it may be. It's about how serious are we, and a lot of groups you'll hear about them having reconciliation action plans, and they'll have a whole lot of key responsibilities that they would take on board to then try to reach different sorts of aspirational targets that they may choose that might be suitable for their organisation. I think for me, it's about being serious, not being tokenistic when not just talking about our people, but wanting to do something for our people in regards to walking alongside Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. And as brother said, it's about looking back and from a bird's eye view downwards to go, yeah, let's have a look at our organisational. What sort of systems do we have in place to support, recruitment, retention, growth, all that sort of stuff. And if we don't have it, how can we move a strategy forward, or how can we develop a strategy to really, really bring some of those awesome, deadly Indigenous community leaders on board and show us the way and how to drive that sort of approach around recovery as well.
Well, look, thank you. And we are fast running out of time. I know there was many more, questions that people have. Many people have actually reached out and said, can we have your contact details? Are you happy, Sam and Bhiamie, for us to share an email address for you?
Yeah, very happy.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
There's a number of people looking for further direction, further ways to go with regard to this conversation. I think this is just the beginning of our dialogue on this, and we would certainly welcome you back to discuss some of the other topics that have been raised in a bit more detail. So I'd like to thank you, Sam and Bhiamie, for making the time to be with us today. On behalf of AIDA, and thank you to everyone online. I think we had 470 people online today. This session has been recorded, and everyone will receive an email once the recording has been uploaded to the Knowledge Hub, so that you can go back and find out key information that you may have missed during what was a very rich presentation for us all. When you exit today's Zoom session, we will be sending you a link to a short survey. We use this information to really learn about what you value as participants and what you would like to hear more about. So please, if you could just take that quick 5 minutes to fill in that survey, we would really appreciate it. Thank you again to Sam and Bhiamie for what's been a really rich and informative discussion today. As I said, I think it's just the beginning of these conversations, and we look forward to working with you both and other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders as we continue to, build our knowledge and understanding to support a disaster resilient Australia. Thank you, everyone, and good afternoon.